Hey, I have a question. Does trauma have an expiration date? A lot of people seem to think so. Let's talk about it. Hi, and welcome to Ask Lois, the Relatable Therapist. My name is Lois Godot, and this channel is all about mental wellness. And so I get my inspiration from a lot of different places. I'll get it from reality TV, what's happening in the world. I may get it from blogs, news, things that's happening on the news, or any place that I think that I can get the information to help me help you with mental wellness. And so today we're going to talk about something that's been in the news. And for some people, it's a little uncomfortable. But remember, I said I get my information from what's happening. And if we look around, we see that this whole Epstein survivors, that's what's going on in the news today, the trauma. And so today, I just want to talk a little bit about trauma. And before we get started, I want to give you a definition of what trauma is. And so trauma is an emotional, psychological, response to a deeply disturbing or life threatening event. It overwhelms the individual, and sometimes it's hard for them to cope. It's a lasting effect on the mental, physical, and behavioral health. And then many times it causes a person to have a sense of not being safe. And trauma doesn't affect everyone in the same way, but there are different types of trauma, can be physical, sexual, natural disasters, serious accidents, a sudden loss, witnessing a traumatic event, or even a medical, and sometimes even ongoing neglect. So trauma is something that affects a lot of people. And so today the question was, does trauma have an expiration date? Because a lot of people seem to think it does. When people ask why survivors connected to the Jeffrey Epstein, why don't they just move on? And I have heard this. I've heard this with my clients. People have told them if they experience any type of trauma, why don't you move on? Why you can't let it go? And so at first it may seem like, well, why would somebody say that? But I have come to realize that it usually reflects a misunderstanding of how trauma really works. Because trauma isn't something that you can just file away like paperwork. It lives in the nervous system, in the body, and even in your memory. And in my opinion, when survivors speak out, it's not about staying stuck. It's often about reclaiming control. And so today we're going to talk about 5 truths about trauma. And so, number 1, telling the story restores power. Because abuse, it strips people of their voice, their choice. And so speaking public about it is a way to reclaim who they are, and it can rewrite the narrative from feeling like a victim to being a survivor. That's exactly what we've seen with the survivors. They are rewriting their story, so they won't be looked at as victims, but they're survivors. And so let me give you an example. So if someone ties you up and takes your wallet, you don't move on by pretending it didn't happen. You report it. You tell someone. That act of speaking is you taking control back over what just happened. And trauma is similar because when survivors speak out, they're not reliving it for drama. They're reclaiming their voice after it was taken. Who deals with the brain? Trauma stays stored until processed, and unspoken trauma often shows up as anxiety, depression, shame, or hypervigilance. And verbalizing the experience helps the brain integrate what happened instead of reliving it. Trauma stays stored until it's processed. So here's an example. If you fall off your bike and scrape your knee, you clean it out so it doesn't get infected. Ignoring it doesn't heal it. You have to do something. And trauma works the same way. If it isn't processed, it continues to just grow and grow and grow internally, and then it manifests as anxiety, sometimes nightmares, sometimes things trigger it. And talking about it is a way of cleaning the wound. So again, what we're talking about is 5 ways that trauma needs to be processed. In order to be able to move on, in order to move past, you have to process it. And again, I know this is new for a lot of people. And so this is why I'm talking about it, because we've heard so many times. I've heard from my clients, just listen to other people just need to move on. What's wrong with them? Why can't they just move on? But hopefully, these 5 ways will give you an understanding of why people need to do all of these things I'm saying to process it, to start the healing process so they can be able to move on. Number 3, breaking the silence reduces shames. Silence protects the perpetrators, not the survivors. When survivors speak, they challenge this secrecy. They're not told to keep that secret anymore. And when you challenge the secrecy, that often breaks the abuse cycle and it breaks the silence. Breaking the silence reduces shame. So imagine getting hit by a car and someone telling you, stop talking about it, just walk it off. That would feel very dismissive and it would be silly because something real happened to you. And when we tell trauma survivors to just move on, it can feel the same way, like their pain isn't real or it's not important or they're just dismissing it. And with the survivors of any type of abuse, when someone tells them to just move on, don't worry about it, that's very, very dismissive of them. And a lot of times they call that re-victimization, they're re-victimizing the individual when you do that. Number 4, validation supports healing. Being believed and heard regulates the nervous system. And when you acknowledge it, it can counteract years of gaslighting or minimization. And I want to say that again. When you validate that you're hearing the person instead of trying to minimize, because for years, what their pain has been minimized, people have been gaslighting them, saying it wasn't that important, or maybe even telling them, like I said earlier, to move on. That's just gaslighting them. And so when you validate them, when you hear them, it's going to take away all those years of not being heard. For example, if a child runs to a parent after being scared, the parent doesn't say, oh, you're fine, just get over it. They would probably kneel down and say, that must have been really scary for you. They're going to acknowledge what happened, and that's going to help the child's nervous system calm down. And that's the same way it is with survivors. They need that same type of validation. They need someone to believe them, someone to believe what happened. And when you do that, that regulates their fears. I'm a therapist and I have a lot of clients that come into my office and they'll say that when they tried to speak out, they were told to be quiet. When they tried to explain the story, people would cut them off. And so when you're not able to say it, even though people may say, you keep talking about it, but you keep talking about it because you're never able to finish the sentence. You're never able to say truly what happened. Because if you say what happened, then that starts that healing process. That starts, just like I said with the child, you starts the nervous system that starts to regulate. You start regulating that fear. That's why it's so important for survivors that their pain, that what they went to has to be validated and they can't be shut down because when you shut them down, you are actually stopping the healing process. Number 5, advocacy creates meaning turning pain into purpose. So whether advocacy means a testimony or awareness, that's all a part of post-traumatic growth. And people who haven't experienced trauma sometimes confuse silence with strength, but real healing often involves safe, supported expression. And that's not dwelling, that's doing the work. And so, for an example, some people who survive a house fire later volunteer with fire safety programs, not because they're stuck in the fire, but because they're turning their pain into purpose. And that helps them move forward. And so speaking out can be a way of transforming something horrible into something protective for others, protective for the individuals. And so, again, when we looked at the survivors the Epstein survivors. And when they spoke out, they were doing it as a way of advocacy. They were turning their pain into purpose, helping other people come forward, helping other people to speak up. And so again, when they say, why don't they just move on? Well, there needs to be some things that they need to do to help them to move on. And one of them is the advocacy. And so I know that sometimes people have never experienced trauma, and it can be hard to understand. Again, as a therapist, talking to some of my clients, their family members or people that they're around, they just don't understand trauma. And they try to explain it to them, and they just don't understand it. And that's okay, because if you've never experienced it, you probably don't understand it. Or if you've not been a therapist or haven't been trained, you probably just don't understand it. But here's some things that you can do to help the survivors instead of accidentally hurting them, instead of re traumatizing them. These are some things that you can do. Number one, you can replace the phrase move on with I'm listening. You don't have to fix it. They're not asking you to fix it. They're not asking you to give the perfect words. All they want you to do is just listen without rushing them. Because when you communicate and allow them to communicate safely, you're actually helping them. I know sometimes people feel like when people come to them, they have to have the right word to say. They have to be able to do something because they feel compelled. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is just listen. That's all they're asking you to do. Just listen, and without telling them to move on, say to them, I'm listening. Or what can I do to help you? But never, that's the worst thing you can tell someone to do is just move on. Because now, once again, you're invalidating how they feel. Another thing you can do is validate without minimizing. So instead of saying something like, well, at least it wasn't worse, at least this didn't happen, try to validate and say, that sounds painful. Or it sounds like that was really hurtful for you. Don't try to compare it with something else because there's nothing to compare it to. I've heard people say, well, for let's just say the Epstein survivors, well, at least you're able to move on with your life. At least you didn't go into drug addiction. At least you don't try to, because that's another way of minimizing it. And you need to validate, because when you validate, it doesn't mean that you fully understand it. It just means that you respect what happened and respect what matters. Number three, let the person set the place for healing. Let the person set the pace for healing. Healing isn't linear, meaning it doesn't go in a straight line, it doesn't go in a certain way, but it's unpredictable. Some days survivors may want to talk, and other days they may not want to talk. Give them control over when and how they share their story. Restore the power that the trauma took away. Don't try to tell them how long it should take. Like I said, the beginning of this, people think there's an expiration date on trauma. There's not an expiration date on it. And you need to understand, just like grief, there's not an expiration date on grief. And so you have to understand that you have to let people do things in their own time. I know a lot of times I've heard people say they should be over it by now. If it was me, this is what I would do. But it's not you. And you need to understand that this takes time. Another thing that I think would be so important is if people would just educate themselves about the trauma, learn about the nervous system, learn how the nervous system responds to threats. And when people understand that, they'll understand that when people have flashbacks and triggers, and that when their body responds to it, that they're not seeking attention. They're not asking for attention. All the thing that they're asking for is compassion so they can grow. And so a lot of times, again, and I have to keep emphasizing this, if you don't understand, educate yourself. Talk to someone about, hey, someone has went through trauma that I know, or I see trauma in the news. Tell me a little bit about that, because I don't want to hurt the person. I want to be able to help them. I don't want to say things that's going to cause them more anxiety or more stress. Five, hold space, not solutions. Think of it like sitting beside someone whose house just burned down. You wouldn't lecture them about rebuilding it immediately. You wouldn't talk to them about what you should have done and how come you didn't do this. You would just sit with them in the ashes and just be present. And that present is all they need because presence is often healing more than advice. I know a lot of time people are just rushed to give advice. Sometimes you don't need advice. I think a lot about Winnie the Pooh when Piglet was having a bad day. He said, I'm just going to sit here and be your friend. Sometimes you don't need to talk. No, you don't need to say anything. Just sit there, and just your presence is reassuring for that person. Sometimes people think that if something happened years ago, speaking now must mean that somebody wants attention, that they're seeking attention. But trauma doesn't run on a calendar, it runs on safety. And many survivors speak when they feel emotionally, financially, or physically safe enough to do so. Trauma survivors don't speak because they're stuck. They're stuck because healing is required. And one way to heal is acknowledgement. And when we respond to these survivors with being patient instead of pressuring them, we become a part of that healing and not another layer of harm. We all care about mental wellness, but sometimes we just don't understand what it takes and what it actually requires for healing to take place. And I said earlier that speaking restores power. It helps process the pain. It helps reduce the shame and it invites validation. It creates meaning. And when all of that happens, safety finally exists. So at the end of the day, mental health isn't about silence, it's about integration. And when someone speaks about their trauma, they're not trying to stay stuck, they're really trying to heal. And so, again, a lot of times people don't understand what trauma is. And I get that. But because you don't understand, that means you need to make a concerted effort to understand what a survivor means. And just because you haven't went through a trauma, or just because you were able to press through, everyone can't do it like the way you've done it. And so you have to be understanding. You have to give them the grace. You have to give them the space to be able to process, and you just be there as a support. And so again, make mental wellness a priority and not an option.